Hello, and welcome to the International Progressive MS Alliance's webcast, coming to you live from Paris at ECTRIMS, the world's largest MS research conference. I'm Dr. Tim Kutze, and I am the Head of Advocacy, Services, and Research for the National MS Society in the United States, and I'm a member of the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee. We're pleased to welcome people from all over the world who are joining us online today to view and take part in an important conversation about progressive MS. This is the second of several webinars that the International Progressive MS Alliance will host to share the story of how we are bringing the world together to solve progressive MS. During today's discussion, we will talk about the uncertainty and unpredictability of progressive MS, and how the global MS community is coming together to address this disease. We'll learn more about how the Alliance is changing the landscape of progressive MS and funding some of the largest, most collaborative, and most innovative research, moving us faster toward answers and solutions for everyone affected by MS. Ending progressive MS is an urgent and unmet need. Worldwide, 2.3 million people live with MS, a complex, degenerative neurological disease which attacks the brain and spinal cord. People living with progressive disease, which is often a more debilitating form of multiple sclerosis, now have hope for the future. So far, the Alliance has funded 25 research projects throughout the world for a total investment of 14.25 million euro. And our collective MS organizations that make up the Alliance have dedicated more than 124 million euro to progressive MS research. Scientific progress continues to be made, including the emergence of the first potential therapies for progressive disease and the continued work of the International Progressive MS Alliance, which is fueling advances in awareness, understanding, and research. But even with the excitement of the first therapies for progressive MS, we know that these will only be effective for some. More must be done so that everyone has an effective treatment. Today, I am pleased to welcome the lead investigators of the Alliance-funded Collaborative Network Awards, which are large, global, four-year studies. Dr. Doug Arnold is a neurologist and the James McGill Professor at McGill University in Canada. He is the founder and president of NeuroRx Research, a company specializing in image analysis for clinical trials. Dr. Gianvito Martino is a full professor of experimental biology at University Vita Salute in San Raffaele in Milan. He is also the scientific director of the San Raffaele Hospital in Milan. Dr. Francisco Quintana is an associate professor at the Ann Romney Center for Neurologic Diseases at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School in Boston. And lastly, Caroline Sincock joins us. Caroline has a PhD in biology and a professional career in intellectual property. Caroline has been involved with research for several years and co-authored a paper on outcome measures for exercise studies in MS. She is also a member of the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee. Welcome to the webcast.
Thank you.
Now, before joining our discussion, let's watch this brief video that talks about how the Alliance is bringing the world together to solve some of the biggest questions around progressive MS.
Progressive MS has impacted us in every way possible. My wife, Jean, was diagnosed with secondary progressive MS, and in a very short period of time, she became quadriplegic.
The future's not bright. It's a progressive illness, progressive MS, it's degenerative.
Per cui io ho imparato ad organizzarmi. Prima magari arrivavo stanchissima, a sera invece adesso mi distribuisco gli impegni durante la settimana.
When it comes to MS, it is something I've always known in my life. There has never been a day when multiple sclerosis wasn't taking something away from someone I loved.
She became nonverbal, she suffered cognitive decline, she receives all her nutrition through a feeding tube.
My father was diagnosed before I was born, and his MS progressed very rapidly, and he passed away when I was young.
Well, the Progressive MS Alliance has become an amazing force in the world.
To know that there's a body, a worldwide body, working towards getting a cure or just working on progressive MS. You feel like there's someone working with you. It's not, you're not alone.
Well, the Alliance has to accomplish an effective treatment for progressive MS.
It's quite a lonely disease because firstly, no one knows why it occurs. There is no cure.
I think focusing people's minds, bringing together the societies, bringing together clinical academics to focus on the area is another really good achievement.
It first represented hope to me, and now it's demonstrating progress.
The goal of this network is to develop a new MRI outcome measure that can be used in phase 2 clinical trials. If we're successful, it'll be possible to do much shorter, smaller, less expensive trials to see if drugs have the potential to work or not.
It's the first time in my experience, and actually the first time in the global MS movement's experience, that organizations have agreed together to fund research, but also to decide on research together.
And it's by having a clear focus and priorities and bringing the resource and the funding together that we believe we will be able to make much quicker progress together than we could ever make apart.
I'd like potential donors to know that this is for real, that we are doing something that has never been done before, and that we are tackling the most important problem in MS, and that the people that are involved in the Progressive Alliance have the ability to deliver, but they need their support to do so.
First of all, we can all make a gift, no matter how big or how small. It all matters, it all contributes, it all makes it move faster.
Io mi auguro che questa alleanza internazionale riesca nell'arco di 10 anni a trovare delle soluzioni per le forme progressive, perché comunque sono quelle ancora orfane di cure, di terapie.
What I want most for the future is for this story to have a happy ending so that other families will never have to experience what we've gone through. A future where we talk about progressive MS in the past tense.
Caroline, in the video, the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee Chair, Professor Alan Thompson, described progressive MS as the most important problem in the field of MS. As someone who lives with progressive MS, how has the disease affected you?
I think anybody watching this webinar and yourself will know that it can affect people very differently. And I'm quite fortunate. It hasn't given me the crippling fatigue or indeed the cognitive impairment that it gives to many. But I have a number of physical symptoms. I have struggled with walking. My left side is very weak. I have problems with my hands. I've lost a lot of manual dexterity. But I've also got a number of what they call the hidden symptoms, like pain, spasticity, pins and needles, and problems with bladder and bowel. And these are the ones which often people don't realise and don't think about. But I think what you can say, and indeed one of the other lay members of the Scientific Steering Committee said, is it impacts on every part of your life, whether it's maritally, socially, financially, as well as physically, emotionally, mentally. And indeed, if you're lucky enough to have a work colleague still and be working, that impacts even on your work environment. So it really does affect all parts of your life. And progressive MS, as I've got secondary progressive, is tireless. It just keeps going and just keeps deteriorating. There is no respite. It impacts on every part of your life, big and small. So it chips away at what you are and what you can do.
Mm-hmm. Well, could you talk a little bit more about that? I just heard you reference it, and others talk about how MS chips away at their lives. What has that looked like for you?
There's two things. It chips away at what you can do, and that's distressing enough, but it also chips away at who you feel you are. It somehow alters what you think your personality is and how you can express it. It sort of muffles who you are, and you don't feel like you're being you anymore. And that's the one that's really difficult to explain often. And, for example, I always felt myself to be somebody who liked doing things on a whim. I like being spontaneous. Well, with MS, you certainly can't be spontaneous any longer. My husband and I used to sort of, nice day, we'd jump in the car and go off to a craft fair or visit a castle. Well, those sort of expeditions now are not impossible, but extremely difficult. You have to work out the route, you have to make sure where the toilets are, you have to take all the mobility equipment, you have to make sure you've got the right drugs with you, you've got to make sure that the access is available when you get there, you can get into the place. It takes away the joy and the pleasure of being able to do it, and it also means I don't feel like I'm me. And I think there's a number of other parts of my life where it has the same sort of feeling. I used to be the one that took everybody places. I was the organiser, I was the one that picked everybody up and took them to the theatre. Now I'm the one being taken, I'm the one being pushed in, I'm the one having my food chopped up for me. Invariably people have to sit in the seats, where the expensive seats, because they're next to the disabled one where I'm going to be. And it's those big things, but it's also the little ones, like I can never volunteer to go and get the ice creams. It's always somebody else that's got to do that. And I think sometimes it's those little things which are the hardest ones to accept, and they're the ones that perhaps hit you unexpectedly. And it was my son's 21st just recently, and I really struggled to write legibly in his card, happy birthday and love mum, and I certainly couldn't wrap his presents. And those little things can really hurt if they take it away. But there's other big things as well. I love being a host. I like doing dinner parties. Well, I can certainly say there's no way I'm doing any cooking now. Unfortunately, all lies with my husband to carry on doing that. Not necessarily for dinner parties, but just generally throughout life. I can't carry a pan of heavy hot water. I can't chop up an onion. I can't stir a gravy. And sadly, I can't even go to the door to welcome guests in the house any longer. So I think, again, you feel like you're not being you. And in a work environment, which I still do some work, but I used to occasionally give talks, but I would be walking up and down a stage in high heels and click-clacking around. And now I can't wear heels, and I certainly can't walk up and down a stage. So you no longer feel sort of slickly professional as you used to do. So again, you take away from what you feel is your credibility as well. So I think it chips away at all parts of your life and what you can do, big and small. It chips away at your personality. And because it's progressive MS, it does so tirelessly and exhaustingly, and just keeps going, unfortunately.
So you've shared some of the challenges of the disease, and I know it's something that all of us are concerned about. I'd like to talk about your involvement with the Progressive MS Alliance and what your role is and what that has meant for you as you've been working with us over the past year.
Well, I applied for the role, and after a year-long interview process, I was very honoured to be then selected as one of the 3 lay members on the Scientific Steering Committee. And the 3 of us have worked together tirelessly over the last 2 years. But it's been something where the Scientific Steering Committee is guiding the scientific principles of the Alliance. So it's extremely important, and as I said, I feel very honoured to be involved in that. But I was interested and motivated from the very beginning because it was clear that the Alliance was putting the people with progressive MS right at the heart, at the centre of what you were doing. And over the last 2 years, I've experienced just that. We really have been involved in some key decisions. We've been involved, for example, in just setting the scientific priorities and confirming they're indeed important and relevant to people with progressive MS. Perhaps another 2 key things we've done is we've actually come to judge those grants, and we've come up with the criteria by which those of us with progressive MS and living with the condition should make those judgments. And the 5 criteria were that it's important to people with MS, that it's relevant to people with MS, that if people with MS are being in clinical trials in that particular research project, their needs are being accommodated appropriately. And similarly, that if people are actually, whether they're in clinical trials or otherwise, those research projects should include people with progressive MS on steering committees and in the governance, and to make sure things are going in the right direction. And then finally, we've also asked that the research results are going to be disseminated and spread to the lay community, including people affected by MS. And we want to see evidence in those original grant applications that that's going to be done. So those criteria we then had the opportunity to actually apply when it came to judging the Network Awards, you'll be pleased to hear. And we were intimately involved in that very collaborative discussion that went over many, many months, using not only those criteria, but very much based on our own expertise. And that expertise is in the lived experience of having the condition and applying that to the judgment of those grants. So I was very honoured to be involved in all that and humbled by the expertise that was surrounding me from the others in the room that were making the decisions with us.
Thank you, and thank you for your commitment to this important work and bringing the voice of people with progressive MS to the Alliance's committee and our work. So I'm turning now to some of the science and the Collaborative Network Awards. Professor Martino, one of the things we know is that discovering effective treatments for progressive MS will have a profound impact on the quality of life, and that's the hope we have, and Caroline has shared some of those real challenges that we're looking to change. Could you share with us why finding treatments for progressive MS is particularly difficult?
Caroline alluded to, while she was talking, she said that there are differences between patients, and this is exactly the problem, because disease pattern and symptom vary significantly from person to person, and complicating, of course, the understanding of how disease progresses. And it's not easy to overcome those challenges, but over the years we have been much more sophisticated in looking at the cellular and molecular mechanisms which could sustain some of the pathogenic mechanisms of the disease. And now it's time to say that we have been identified several targets that we can think we could hit in order to find a new therapy. As an example, the drug you were alluding to, which has been approved recently, originally was considered to be an immunomodulatory drug, which could never function in the progressive form of the disease, while the trial was positive. And this means, for example, that the inflammation is part of the progression, something that we didn't know before. We thought before that only axonal damage, or the damage of the neuron, of the cells conducting the electrical impulses, was the reason for the progression. But nowadays we know that it's much more complicated. There are much more molecules and cells which are participating in the progression of the disease, and therefore we have much more hit to target. This is the good news.
Mm-hmm. Well, the project you're leading is titled Brave in MS, and your objective with the network is to find one or more drugs that can repair the damage or protect it from damage altogether. Could you share with us what is the focus of the study and what you hope it will achieve?
Most of the people probably do not know, but over the years there are much more drugs developed than the one that we really used. And therefore now those drugs which have been already approved for being used in humans, but are not used because they've been developed for other purposes, and maybe the development has been altered, or for several reasons those drugs have been abandoned, are drugs which could be tested in MS, because some of them could be capable of hitting the target I was alluding before. Those drugs are called repurposed drugs, are thousands of drugs, and using those drugs in a platform in order to try to understand if they work in progressive MS could mean that we can have costs which are cheaper than expected, because if you use those drugs which are already been approved, you have just to test them in humans. You don't need to do all the preclinical work, for example. Second, the process is much faster because it doesn't take 15 years, for example, but in 3-4 years you can get to the point of using those drugs or testing those drugs in humans. And probably they are more efficacious, because when you start, this is something we say among scientists, that when you start with 10,000 potential therapeutic molecules, you end up after 20 years with just one. In the drugs, the repurposed drugs used so far, the success rate is around 30%. So I think we will start from this point. We will screen out of those drugs which could fit with this disease, and then we will test them in silico first, so using a computerized system to select the best. Then we will try to see they work in vitro. This means in the laboratory, in cell culture or this kind of tools. And finally, we will use those the drugs which pass through this filtering system, step-by-step system. We will use them in animal models. And we hope after 4 years to end up with 1 or 2 that could immediately be tested in progressive MS patients.
So it sounds like you hope that you'll be able to discover treatments sooner, test them faster, and really accelerate the development process for people with progressive MS.
Let's hope.
We hope. So Professor Quintana, similar to Professor Martino, you're leading a team that is focused on identifying potential drugs that could protect the brain from damage in progressive MS. Could you share with us a little bit about your project and give us some background about what the importance of this work is for those who may not have a scientific background?
So as Professor Martino was saying, we do appreciate now that inflammation contributes to the pathogenesis of progressive MS. The question is trying to understand what type of inflammation and then how can we target it, right? Why couldn't we target it with the drugs that are already approved for the treatment of MS therapy? So what we are doing is actually we're focusing on trying to understand what controls inflammation within the CNS, and how can we either repurpose drugs that actually will target that inflammation, and therefore we can use what has been learned for other diseases to treat MS, or we can identify new targets, new ways of targeting that inflammation localized within the CNS. And we believe at the core of it is trying to target what we call a different part of the immune response, what we call innate immunity, rather than the classical leukocytes or T cells and B cells that are targeted by most available therapies.
So that's interesting. So the innate, most people will be familiar with the other types of immune cells. Could you talk to us a little bit about the innate immune system? What is it, and why is it relevant in progressive MS?
So what we know is that within, in the context of progressive MS, there's this activation of cells that reside within the CNS.
And that, just to stop you, CNS, the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord?
That's perfectly right,
yes.
Yeah. And these cells are actually different from the T cells, the B cells we know about, which are cells that are experienced, right? And that are the cells that we train, we educate when we have vaccines, right? Mm-hmm. These cells were focused on this innate immune response. It's actually a different type of cell, and it responds to is controlled by different mechanisms. And these cells are called, for example, astrocytes or microglia or monocytes. And as I mentioned before, they are not targeted by by all the therapies that we have tested before.
Right. So basically, that's been probably contributing to some of our failures. Is that the treatments we have now don't target the innate immune system.
Exactly. The idea is how can we expand the aspects of the immune response that we're targeting in order to have a more efficient downregulation of inflammation.
Okay. Well, thank you. So we've heard a bit about finding new treatments and the pathology of the disease and learning about the role of the innate immune system. Professor Arnold, you're leading a network that is focused on a different aspect of progressive MS, and one that you're hoping will develop a test that predicts changes in the brain during MS progression. Could you tell us a little bit about your work and what are the areas you're focused on?
Yes, so this is an international network that will try and develop an MRI test that will allow us to predict which patients with progressive MS are actually going to get worse clinically or progress. And also provide a measure that can be used in early phase clinical trials to detect which drugs have more potential to go into the large late phase trials that are very expensive. The plan is to use the new emerging technology, machine learning or deep learning, and to train a deep learning algorithm that will be able to recognize progression and measure it. To do this, we need a lot of scans, which we've assembled with the help of a large number of international investigators and also a large number of pharmaceutical companies that are involved with MS treatment. And we're still in the early days, but we hope to have such an algorithm available for general distribution at the end of this trial.
I see. So as I understand it, your project basically is you're gathering the MRI images of people that have participated in other clinical trials, and so they've contributed, and those MRIs are stored somewhere. How many images are you hoping to capture?
So we're planning to get about 40,000 images at the moment. This number may actually be expanded as time goes on. There's a general trend towards acquiring large volumes of data these days, and it may be that, you know, in another year or two there may be other sources of data that we can tap. To develop these machine learning algorithms, you need a large number of data sets. They can learn anything. They just need enough data to learn it.
So just to define machine learning, basically the computer looking at the image and making a prediction, and then the doctor basically interpreting that with the patient?
Well, it's in this case, the doctor has relatively little to do with it. So the machine learning, or what people may refer to as artificial intelligence, recognizes features in the image that people may not be able to see or appreciate, but that in fact are connected with the progression of MS. Our brains actually work that way. You know, when we recognize a face, we have layers in the cortex that work like the layers of a deep learning machine. And the things that they recognize are not, they're not things that we're consciously aware of. They might be edges, orientation of certain edges, things like that. But the brain then puts them all together in order to create a mental image of a face which it can identify. We're trying to do the same thing in an MR image so that we can recognize the characteristics of progression.
I've heard you describe this as basically a test that will speed up clinical trials. So as I understand it, I'm imagining that essentially if somebody's participating in a clinical trial, the clinicians, the doctors will be able to spot how they're doing based on the MRI?
So at the moment, we don't have a marker that we can use in early clinical trials. And so if you want to develop a drug for progressive MS, you have to do a very large phase 3 clinical trial with, you know, perhaps thousands of patients who are followed for at least 2, maybe 3 years. This costs many hundreds of millions of dollars and puts a high bar to entry into this field. What we hope to do here is develop a marker that is much more sensitive than the clinical outcomes that are used in these large phase 3 trials. Something that will be able to predict, first of all, which patients are going to progress, so enrich the trial with patients who are going to progress, and then be able to measure that progression quicker and in a much smaller number of patients, so that the drugs that are being developed by my colleagues here can actually go into clinical trials and produce an answer that basically tells us if they have potential or not rather quickly and at much less cost than we currently have to deal with.
Thank you. So for the viewers, accelerating the process, creating speed, and really taking advantage of the contributions of the thousands of people who live with MS who participated in those studies. And that's the importance of why it's so critical that people participate in studies, but also that we take advantage of the data that already exists.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So Professor Martino, recently, Ocrevus was approved as the first treatment for primary progressive MS in the United States, Australia, and now Switzerland. There are other treatments in the drug pipeline for progressive MS, but you know, could you share a little bit about what else is in the pipeline and how they could be used for progressive MS?
But there are several drugs which are under scrutiny in the progressive MS, but so far we cannot tell anything about any of these drugs because we don't have yet solid data to share, and therefore we should continue to feed our pipeline because we are just at the beginning. We are not at the end of the process. We are just at the beginning. We need much more drugs because don't forget that we, of course, are aiming at finding drugs which are interfering with the pathogenic process because we think, and this is reasonable, that this is the most efficacious way to block the disease. But we have many other drugs which can be also useful in MS for symptoms management, for example, for inducing or repairing or inducing regeneration and recreating new myelin, or maybe for supporting the health of the axons. I mean, as I said before, there are many different targets that the fundamental research is continuously discovering, and more targets we find, much easier it would be to find someone who could really fit with those targets in terms of therapeutic agents.
Mm-hmm. So for both Professor Quintana and Arnold, I think one of the challenges about developing treatments and the drug pipeline are, understanding the biology, conducting clinical trials. When you hear what Professor Martino described, I mean, what are your thoughts around what are the things that we need to do to try to get more treatments moving faster through the pipeline? And what are some of the barriers that, as scientists, you see just that are getting in our way? So perhaps with you, Professor Quintana.
So I think one of the challenges is actually, as Professor Martino was referring to earlier, trying to understand what are the mechanisms that contribute to pathogenesis, right? Because then we can understand what our candidate drugs should be targeting and so on and so forth. So, for example, what we have done in order to address that is we have established this international consortium where we have this complementary expertise, right? We have geneticists, we have molecular biologists, we have drug developers. And the idea is literally to understand what are the pathways that operate within the CNS, and that's a big challenge, right? How can you understand what's going on within the CNS, within the central nervous system, as a way of identifying what are the mechanisms that drive progression, and then how can you intervene?
From my perspective, what we need to do is be able to evaluate more new drugs more quickly and more cheaply. And that's, in fact, what we're trying to accomplish by developing this test, which can substitute for the clinical outcomes, which are highly variable, as Dr. Martino suggested, and require these very large trials that are very expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know that one of the things about being at the ECTRIMS meeting is you see lots of science, and there's 10,000 I think scientists here in Paris exchanging a lot of information. I've been struck in looking at the abstracts about how much work there is happening in progressive MS. Some of the viewers may wonder, well, did this all just appear, or is there what is contributing to the heightened interest in progressive MS and trying to address some of these challenges? Perhaps we'll start with you, Fran, and then we can ask the panel.
So I think, as it was said in the presentation we saw, it's probably one of the most important unmet clinical needs for MS, trying to understand what drives progressive MS and eventually trying to understand, to have drugs to treat patients. So in that sense, I think that's actually what is driving that, the understanding that this is an important issue that has to be addressed. And the other thing that is important to note, as you say, is that many of these efforts that now are flourishing in terms of our projects, trying to find new biomarkers or new therapies for remyelination, they're actually the result of years and years of work that actually paved the way, not only our work, the work of others paved the way of trying to understand what are those questions that should be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Professor Martino?
My impression, I mean, unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember when the first drugs for relapsing remitting disease was developed at the end of 80s. And I'm feeling the same excitement around the progressive MS in the scientific community that we had at that time. And the challenge at that time was really to put everybody together to try to join in forces in terms of investment, of course, but also in terms of brain scientists working together. And then it took a little bit to develop the drugs that the market then approved later on. Nowadays, since of PMSA and all this network we are creating, I think that we are avoiding this preparatory step, and we can be much faster, since we are already working together, to jump into the field in concrete terms, to develop drugs which can be really effective for those forms of the disease. And therefore, I'm quite optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Professor Arnold?
So, if you'll permit me, I think the International Progressive MS Alliance has had a lot to do with the current energy for research in progressive MS. Not only by providing funding, but by getting people together and facilitating these large international collaborations and the involvement of all the drug companies to all work together, contribute resources, in my case, images that will allow us to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Caroline, any reaction to the comments?
Well, I was going to say it's all incredibly exciting. And certainly I think even the 2 years in which I've been involved, it's moved from being something which was raising the awareness of a problem about which we knew very little, to really quite hopeful progress. And that in itself is, well, hopeful and exciting. And listening to the particular grants that have been given, they're incredibly exciting. And it means over the next 4 years there's potential for biomarkers and perhaps for new drugs for remyelinization and deeper neuroprotection. And I think the fact that all of this has happened, and the network awards in particular, they've raised the profile of the Alliance, which is really important because it's raised the profile of the condition. And it raises that profile, means people understand why we need the money. It means people understand the amount of energy and work that's going into this and what we've still got to learn. And I think that's really important. So overall, I've been very, honoured and humbled to be exposed to all this and delighted by the progress that's being made. And I think that it's an experience to be involved with such terrific people. The energy and enthusiasm and commitment that's in the room when you're working with the Alliance is just extraordinary. And it's really quite humbling, the kindness of strangers. And so the other thing I'd like to say is thank you very much indeed for your work and efforts, and long may it continue.
It will. And just to, have a few more questions for that I know our viewers may be interested in is, we haven't talked too much about treatments to address some of the symptoms of progressive MS, fatigue, pain, some of the cognitive challenges. And I know a lot of our focus has been in terms of remyelinating treatments that modify the disease. Perhaps could you talk a little bit about what are some of those barriers around addressing some of those both visible and the hidden symptoms that Caroline talks about? Perhaps we'll start with you, Doug, as one of our clinicians.
Well, so this is not really my area of expertise, but there are a variety of symptomatic therapies that are available to deal with symptoms like spasticity or sensory symptoms, particularly if they become painful, to help patients with bladder control. These are also evolving in parallel with the kinds of therapies that have been discussed here, which are generally referred to as disease-modifying therapies. From the point of view of what we would like to do with progressive MS, it's good to be able to treat the symptoms, but what we really want to do is prevent them from occurring in the first place, and for that we need the kind of drugs that the group here is trying to develop. Yeah.
Gianvito, anything to add?
I agree 100% with Doug. I would like to just to remember that one of the most important symptoms, which is fatigue, and Caroline was very nicely describing the consequence of this chronic fatigue, is very difficult to challenge because we don't have models in which we can prove neither the pathogenic mechanism behind this, because we don't know yet why chronic fatigue is a predominant symptom in a MS patient, and therefore we have to jump into patient if we have something that we think is ready to be used in humans. But running a trial in humans means investment, and most of the symptomatic drugs are not expensive drugs. And of course, the return in terms of investment is not easy to predict. And of course, there is a little bit of reluctance from company, which is justified, of course, not to invest too much into these particular areas. So there are barriers from both the scientific community, which is not able still to get into the problem in terms of molecules and cells, and on the other hand, there is a little bit of reluctance to invest into this field because there are already, as Doug said before, there are already many treatments. And most of the drugs which are used for treating symptoms in MS are repurposed drugs, which was the discussion we did before, for the reason that I mentioned, because they're much cheaper.
Yeah. So as we're coming to wrap up our time together, I am interested if the three of our distinguished scientific panelists could just take a few minutes and really share what is the one thing you would want people with progressive MS to know, both about the progress you're making, but also what you see as what you hope are the questions that we will be solving within the next few years. So we'll start with Professor Arnold and go to Professor Martino.
I think what I would like people to realize is that there's hope. There's light at the end of this tunnel. We are starting to appreciate more and more some of the issues that underlie progression in MS. We're getting a better handle on different strategies to treat it and developing better methods to measure whether those treatments are working. So I think although it always takes longer than one would like, it's a slow process to do research and to do drug development. I think we're actually making good progress and that there's light at the end of this tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Professor Quintana.
So I would agree, and I think what I would like them to know is that to be conscious about this massive effort. I think one important thing is the effort that and the value of the Progressive Alliance, and that's going back to what Professor Martino was saying. I mean, you have these collaborative networks, you have people from all over the world with all these different areas of expertise that are complementary, thinking about the problem and trying to come up with solutions. And I think that's making a significant contribution to the field, and at the end of the day, we hope there's going to be a very practical implication, which is to have better ways to test drugs and actually to have better candidate drugs to be tested.
Mm-hmm. Professor Martino.
The most important part of the story, at least in my view, is that we are really working in a sort of multidisciplinary way. Science is not anymore a one-man show. It's not possible. If you want to do real good science, you have to join forces with colleagues which are expert in a certain area, and you need them. You need to join forces to be really effective. And not only joining forces, but possibly sharing ideas with colleagues from other fields in order to be more effective. And therefore, in all our network, of course, we have been trying to involve the physicists, engineering, designing computer-based neural network, or even people working in the industry in order to give us the best drugs to test. And therefore, it's not only working as a network, but also having within networks different expertise in order to cross-fertilize each other. I think this is the beauties of what you did with the PMSA, with the Progressive MS Alliance, to try to force people to stay together, but also to make people thinking which should be the best and the right partner to involve to just get the goal. This is what and I'm also optimistic as Doug and Professor Quintana, because we really think that there is light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So, Caroline, just interested in your reflections. You've been with part of our Alliance team now for over a year, and helping us really do some important work, some of which you've heard today. Mm-hmm. How has this shaped your perspective on the future in progressive MS?
Well, I'm delighted to hear there's light at the end of the tunnel. That's very heartening, and I do think that's probably the biggest change for me, is I came into this because I had progressive MS and because I felt, I think on the video people said, left behind. There was nothing for us. And now I feel that's changed. There really is effort and energy, passion and commitment, and the intellect that's been evidenced today being put forward to actually help that be different. And that's, as I said, extremely heartening and very hopeful. And thank you.
Well, if you had one thing to share with our viewers about what you would want them to take away as they leave this webinar as a person affected by progressive MS, what would you want them to know?
Give us more money. I think it's got to go on. It's got to carry on. There's still work to be done. And I'm just delighted with as I've said, the enthusiasm and the commitment that's in the room. But we also need to make sure we can afford to do more. And that's my biggest plea to everybody here, probably.
Well, thank you, Caroline, and thank you to Professors Arnold, Martino, and Quintana for your commitment to finding solutions, for your leadership on these incredible collaborative effort. We know that is changing the world for people with progressive MS. So as you've seen, the Alliance is an unprecedented global collaboration of MS organizations, researchers, clinicians, pharmaceutical companies, and people living with progressive MS. And I think our webcast has illustrated the network of relationships that are part of the Progressive MS Alliance. We are drawing the MS community together and aligning important research activities to combine efforts so that we can learn as fast as possible so that we can get treatments to those who need them. The Alliance has inspired hope and made progress. I hope that today's webinar has been an illustration of that. Since 2014, the Alliance has committed to the overall global research investments, and we're aiming to change the landscape of progressive MS quickly by developing the tools like Dr. Arnold is developing, as well as discovering the new treatments like Dr. Martino and Quintana are doing. By remaining focused on our priorities, we will enable new treatment discovery while reducing the time and cost of testing these potential treatments. A pathway for treatments for progressive MS is emerging. There's never been a better time for such concerted action, and we now need to deliver, and all of us are committed to delivering. For more information on the Alliance, or to donate, or to sign up for our quarterly newsletter, please go to the Alliance website, progressivemsalliance.org. Thank you for joining us today, live from ECTRIMS in Paris, France. Thank you, and good day.